Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. It was early fall 2021, and the world was still trying to make sense of the pandemic. People were stuck in their homes, only venturing out for essentials. As someone who lived for adventure, I saw this as the perfect excuse to escape the chaos and explore new places. Being an avid backpacker and camper, I packed my gear and decided to travel to various national parks across the country, distancing myself from everything I had left behind. One of the places I chose was a remote trail in Glacier National Park in Montana. The air was crisp, and the towering mountains cast long shadows across the rugged terrain. I had my reasons for wanting to be far away from others. The events of the previous year had left me with a bad reputation, and a lot of people who didn't like me. To avoid the constant stress and harassment, I had to change my phone number, relocate to a different city, and even quit my job. I'd made a huge mistake at work that cost people a lot of money, and the backlash was brutal. The harassment didn't stop. I started receiving cryptic messages from random numbers, and some of them were downright threatening. I couldn't tell if it was the same person or a group of people using multiple numbers, but I started to wonder if it was all one person who was going through a lot of effort to mess with me. It was exhausting. The texts eventually stopped for a while, and I hoped that maybe it had all blown over, or that the people who were after me had finally lost interest. It was during this brief period of peace that I decided to take my mind off everything and venture into the wilderness. I drove up to Glacier National Park, a 3-hour drive from the small town I was staying in, hoping to clear my head. There were no crowds, which wasn't surprising given the pandemic restrictions, but it suited me just fine. I parked my truck at the trailhead, strapped on my backpack, and started the hike to a secluded creek I'd read about online. There was something eerie about the quietness of the place. The sound of my boots crunching on the frosty ground echoed through the forest. I finally reached the creek, and despite it being the fall, it wasn't frozen. The water flowed gently, and the peace of the scene made me feel like I could finally relax. I set up camp a little off the trail. There was no one around, just the vast expanse of trees and the creek. After setting up my tent, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal, sausages over the flames. I'd packed a book with me, so I sat down by the fire, cracking it open. The warmth from the fire felt comforting against the cold night air. As the light began to fade, I switched on my headlamp, not wanting to stumble in the dark, and took a few hits of weed to calm my nerves. That's when it happened. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Normally, I wouldn't have cared, but I had a feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I pulled it out and saw a string of texts from an unknown number. My stomach sank when I recognized the area code, 203. It was from Connecticut, an area I didn't know anyone from. The first text said, "How's the camping going, buddy?" The second text read, "It's beautiful out here." The third one said, "I see why you came up here." I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. No one knew I was here, at least no one I had shared this trip with. I was already on edge from the weed, and now my anxiety was spiking. My fingers shook as I typed, "Who is this?" I half expected it to be a prank from a friend. But the fact that they said, "I see why you came up here," made me feel like someone was watching me. I stood up, looking around nervously, doing a full 360-degree sweep of the woods. The trees loomed around me in the dimming light, and I felt exposed. My mind raced. I reached into my bag and pulled out my handgun, not because I thought I was in immediate danger, but because the fear was overwhelming. It's strange how isolation in a place like this can make your mind go wild. Usually, I'd put out the fire before crawling into my tent for the night, but tonight, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to be out there in the dark. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and sat in the corner with my phone, my heart pounding. I stared at the screen, waiting for a response. Minutes felt like hours. I tried to distract myself by reading my book again, but I couldn't concentrate. The anxiety from the texts was gnawing at me. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or worse, was it someone who was actually here with me? Another message came through. The person responded, "Doesn't matter anymore." My heart stopped. This wasn't just a prank. It couldn't be. I quickly typed back, "How do you know I'm camping?" But, as before, no reply came. I stared at the screen, waiting, my mind spiraling. What kind of person sends messages like this? I couldn't help but wonder, was this someone who had been harassing me all along? But how would they know I was here? I had kept my plans private. My mind raced with possibilities. The fire outside had burned low, and the sound of the crackling logs was replaced by the eerie silence of the night. The woods were dead quiet. No wind, no sounds of animals, just the sharp, unnerving silence that seems to grow louder the longer you listen. I felt like I was being watched, and the paranoia crept in. I killed an hour by watching some random videos on YouTube, trying to take my mind off the situation. A true crime documentary was playing on my phone, but the timing was terrible. The creepy vibe of the story I was watching mixed with my real-life anxiety, and it made the whole thing feel like a nightmare. Then, just as I thought I might be able to get a few hours of sleep, I received another text. It simply said, "I'm still here." I froze. That was it. There was no more denying it. Someone was out there, and they were watching me. I didn't know what to do. My phone buzzed again, but this time I couldn't bring myself to look. The thought of checking it made my skin crawl. I gathered up what little courage I had left, grabbed my handgun, and decided I wasn't staying in the tent any longer. The rest of the night felt like a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in the forest made my heart race. At dawn, I packed up and left. I didn't bother finishing the hike. I just got in my truck and drove, the tension in my body not easing until I had driven miles away from that creek. Looking back, I can't help but wonder what really happened that night. Was it someone who knew me? Or was it someone from my past, trying to mess with me even from far away? I never found out, but the fear of that night stayed with me long after I left Glacier National Park. I still get messages now and then, but I've learned to ignore them. Maybe it's better that way. I still get the occasional strange message, but I've learned to let them slide. Some days, I tell myself that it's all just a coincidence, some random prank, or maybe even a glitch in the system. But there are nights like the one in Glacier, that always come back to haunt me. A few weeks after I left the park, the texts started up again. They were subtle at first, just a few simple phrases, "It's quiet tonight, and I wonder if you'll go back." That last one shook me to my core. How could they know what I was thinking? The words haunted me, like an echo that wouldn't go away. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some overzealous prankster, but deep down, something gnawed at me. How could they know so much about my movements? How had they known I was camping in the first place? The strange messages always seemed to come at just the right time, like they were watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I thought about going to the police, but what would I say? How could I explain that some stranger knew I was camping in a national park when I hadn't told a soul? It seemed too ridiculous, too far-fetched. I figured I'd just keep my distance and stay vigilant. But that was before I received one final message. It came late one night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, waking me from my half-slumber. I picked it up, half expecting another cryptic message. But this time, the text was different. It was a picture. The image was grainy and dark, but I could make out a figure standing just outside a tent. The figure was cloaked in shadow, but I could tell it was a person. My heart dropped into my stomach. I jumped out of bed and rushed to my front door. I checked the locks, bolted the windows, and made sure every light was on. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. The next day, I did some digging. I had to know who was behind this, or at least try to. I traced the number using an online tool, but it only took me to a dead end. No names, no addresses, nothing but more anonymity. I could feel the walls closing in. And then, the calls started. They came at all hours of the day and night, sometimes one after another, other times spaced out over several days. The caller would never say anything, just silence on the other end. It was as though they were waiting for me to speak, to acknowledge them. But I never did. I just hung up. One night, as I was sitting in my living room, the phone rang again. This time, I decided to answer. Maybe, just maybe, I could get some answers. Hello? I said, my voice shaky. There was a pause, then a voice came through the phone. It was deep, distorted, like someone was using a voice changer. How's your camping going, buddy? I froze. It was the same words from the first message. The same tone. It was as though they had never left. I slammed the phone down and sat there, staring at the device as if it were some sort of cursed object. I didn't know who this person was or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to stop until they had their answers. I packed up and left again the next morning, just like before, though this time, I didn't go to a national park. I didn't want to go anywhere that might have memories of those terrifying nights. Instead, I went to a small, quiet town on the coast, hoping the isolation would give me some peace. But peace, it seems, is hard to come by when you're being hunted. To this day, I still don't know who was behind the texts, the pictures, the calls. Sometimes, I wonder if it was all a sick game, someone from my past, maybe, getting back at me for my mistakes. Or maybe it was someone who just took too much pleasure in watching me squirm. But whatever it was, I never went back to Glacier, and I never camped alone again. Something about that night, about the silence and the strange messages, made me realize that some places are best left unexplored, and some people should never be given the satisfaction of knowing they've scared you. As for the texts, they stopped as abruptly as they started. No warning, no final message. Just silence. But I know better than to think that silence means safety. I still check my phone from time to time, and when I do, I can't help but wonder if there's someone, somewhere, waiting for me to slip again. It's a strange feeling, living with that kind of uncertainty, but it's become my new normal. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if today will be the day they show up. And maybe, just maybe, they're still out there. Watching. Waiting. The strange messages and eerie phone calls had stopped, but the paranoia lingered. I could never quite shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Life, however, continued, and I tried to go about my days as best as I could, hoping that whatever had happened in Glacier was behind me. But the fear never truly left. I stayed in that small town by the coast for a few weeks, avoiding large crowds and sticking to quiet, solitary places. It was a good way to keep my mind off the past, but I still couldn't help glancing over my shoulder every time I stepped outside, every time I heard a car pass by. I didn't want to live in fear, but it was hard not to when it felt like I was being hunted. Then, one evening, something happened that brought everything rushing back. I had just returned to my small apartment after a long walk along the beach. It was late, the kind of late when the world feels like it's holding its breath, suspended in silence. As I approached my door, I noticed something strange. A small envelope was wedged under it. There were no markings, no indication of who had left it there. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the envelope, as though I could will it to disappear. I bent down cautiously and picked it up. The paper was thick, old-fashioned, definitely not something I'd expect from anyone I knew. My heart raced as I turned it over, expecting a name, an address, anything that might give me a clue. There was nothing. I opened the envelope slowly, my hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, written in messy handwriting, were 3 words. I'm still here. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to laugh it off. Maybe it was just a prank, a sick joke from someone trying to mess with me. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't some random prank. This was the same feeling I'd had the night in Glacier, the same dread, the same nagging certainty that something wasn't right. I didn't know who it was, or what they wanted, but it was clear to me that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment, double-checked my phone settings, and even set up a few cameras inside, just in case. I couldn't afford to take any chances anymore. The idea of being followed or watched had become so ingrained in my mind that I couldn't relax, couldn't sleep. Days turned into weeks, and still, I heard nothing. The silence was almost worse than the messages. The constant tension of waiting for something to happen gnawed at me. It was like being trapped in a room where the walls were closing in, but I had no idea when the door would finally open. And then, one day, I received another text. It was from an unknown number, just like before. We know where you are. I nearly dropped my phone. Panic surged through me, and for the first time since I'd left Glacier, I felt completely helpless. Whoever this was had been watching me for months, tracking my every move. They knew where I lived. They knew where I'd been. And they were still out there, somewhere. I tried to call the police, but what could I even tell them? How could I explain that someone had been stalking me for months, sending me cryptic messages, and now they were threatening me? There was no evidence. No way to prove anything. I felt like I was losing control of my own life, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep running from this invisible force. That night, after I sent the text, I heard something. A faint tapping on my window. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then it came again, louder this time. A rhythmic knock, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly glanced around my apartment, making sure everything was locked. The tapping continued, persistent and unnerving. It was coming from the window in my bedroom. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. Should I check? Should I just call the police? But then, a thought struck me. The silence. The messages. The phone calls. They'd all been building up to this moment. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking as I moved toward the bedroom. The tapping stopped the second I reached the window, and for a moment, everything was still. I felt like I was holding my breath. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow. It was quick, almost like a blur, but I saw it, someone standing just outside, partially hidden behind the tree in my yard. I couldn't make out their face, but I could see the outline of their body, the way they moved. It was someone, and they were watching me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and my phone slipped from my hand. I was frozen. The same feeling from glaciers swept over me, the feeling that I was no longer in control of my own life. And then, the phone rang again. I didn't even have to look at the screen. I already knew it was them. I could feel it in my bones. I took a deep breath and picked up the phone, my voice barely a whisper as I said, "What do you want?" The voice on the other end was distorted, deep, and unrecognizable. It sounded almost mechanical. "We're not done yet." That was all they said before the call ended. Just like that, the line went dead. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold the phone. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, cornered, like there was nowhere left to run. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I couldn't risk being in one place long enough for them to find me. I had to leave again, to disappear, to start over somewhere new. But as I packed up my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't matter where I went. Whoever this was, they would find me. I had made a mistake. I'd tried to outrun my past, but it had followed me, no matter how far I went, no matter how many new places I visited. It was always there, lurking in the background, waiting to catch up. As I left that apartment for good, I realized something chilling. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just begun. The sound of my heart pounding in my chest was the only thing I could hear as I stepped out of the apartment. The once cozy, safe place now felt like a trap. I was being hunted, but I had no idea who was doing it, or why. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed. Whoever was behind this had been tracking me for months, and now, it felt like they were getting closer. I packed my things in a frenzy, trying to make sure I didn't leave anything behind that could give them an advantage. Every movement felt deliberate, calculated, like I was preparing for a battle I wasn't sure I could win. The phone calls, the cryptic messages, the shadow outside my window, they were all pieces of the same puzzle, but I had no idea what the picture looked like. I couldn't stay in this town. I couldn't stay anywhere for too long. The fear was consuming me, and every new place I went felt more suffocating than the last. I had to leave, but where could I go? There was no place far enough, no town too small, no forest too deep to escape this. It wasn't just about distance, it was about the fear of being known, of being hunted. I decided to leave the apartment behind, and with it, any trace of my existence. I took only the essentials, my car, my phone, a few changes of clothes, and a small amount of cash. The rest, I left behind. I couldn't keep running with so many attachments. I had to sever all connections, real or virtual. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. It didn't take long for the fear to creep back in. Every car I passed on the highway, every person I saw in a store, felt like a potential threat. They could all be connected to whoever was after me. I couldn't trust anyone. Not even myself. I drove through the night, far from the city, as far from the life I once knew as I could get. The road stretched out ahead of me, a never-ending trail of asphalt and headlights. But no matter how far I drove, no matter how many miles I put between me and the past, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there. Watching. Waiting. After several days on the road, I found myself in a small town in northern Wyoming. It wasn't a place I had ever been to before, and I hadn't told anyone I was coming. It felt like the perfect place to disappear, to start over. The town was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, yet no one really asks questions. It seemed safe, almost comforting in its simplicity. I rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, far enough away from the main street to feel isolated, but close enough to not attract attention. For the first time in months, I felt a slight sense of relief. Maybe this was the place where I could finally get some peace. But that night, as I sat alone in the cabin, something didn't feel right. The silence was overwhelming, suffocating. I was too used to the sound of the world around me, the hum of traffic, the murmur of people, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But here, in this tiny town, there was nothing. The stillness settled around me like a thick fog, and I could almost hear my own thoughts louder than ever before. I sat in the dim light of the cabin, staring at the walls, feeling the weight of isolation pressing in on me. I couldn't escape the thought that I was being watched. I had left everything behind, my past, my phone, my job, but it didn't matter. Whoever this was, they had found me once, and they would find me again. The phone call came just after midnight. I had been lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when the sound of my phone ringing sliced through the silence. I grabbed it, my heart leaping into my throat. It was from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaking. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then the same distorted voice from before spoke. "We know where you are." My blood ran cold. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to steady my breath. How do you know where I am?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. There was another pause, and then the voice responded, slower this time, as if savoring the moment. "We've always known." I could feel my stomach tighten with dread. This wasn't just some random person. This was someone who had been tracking me, someone who knew exactly where I was at all times. I didn't know how they had found me, whether it was through my old phone number, my past, or something else, but I couldn't escape them. I hung up abruptly, my hands trembling. My mind raced, spinning in a frenzy of confusion and fear. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. How could they have found me again? How could they always be one step ahead? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my heart race. I kept thinking I saw shadows moving outside, heard footsteps in the distance. The paranoia was overwhelming, and I was trapped in a prison of my own making. The isolation I had sought had become my greatest enemy. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't escape. The next morning, I packed my things and left the cabin. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay anywhere for too long. But this time, I didn't know where to go. I drove aimlessly for hours, not knowing what I was looking for or where I was headed. I just needed to be away from the cabin, away from the feeling that I was being hunted. It wasn't until I reached the edge of a small town that I began to notice something strange. There was a car that had been following me for miles. It was a black sedan, its tinted windows reflecting the sunlight, always staying just far enough behind me to remain unnoticed. But I couldn't ignore it. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was there. I took a sharp turn down a narrow road, hoping to lose them, but the sedan followed. I took another turn, and another, but it never let up. Whoever was in that car wasn't just following me, they were hunting me. And I knew that if I didn't do something soon, I wouldn't be able to escape. I pulled into an old, abandoned gas station and parked behind a large building. I killed the engine, sat still, and waited. The sedan passed by slowly, not slowing down, just continuing on its way. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But I couldn't relax. Not yet. I stayed in that town for a few more days, keeping to myself, hiding in the shadows. The fear gnawed at me, relentless, as if I were a prisoner in a game I didn't understand. I knew they were still out there, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. I was trapped in a cycle, running from something I could never escape. The world felt smaller with each passing day. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I changed my location, they always found me. The fear became a constant companion, one I couldn't shake. I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. But what if the answers I found were even worse than the fear itself? The unknown was more terrifying than anything I had experienced so far. Whoever was behind this, whoever had been stalking me for so long, they knew things about me, things no one should know. I wasn't sure who I could trust, who I could turn to. And so, the hunt continued. I didn't know how it would end. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let them win. Not without a fight. I couldn't sleep that night. The isolation, the ever-present paranoia, gnawed at me relentlessly. The silence outside the cabin was suffocating. No sounds of animals, no rustle of wind in the trees, just an unnerving stillness that felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. I kept my eyes on the road outside, hoping the black sedan wouldn't appear again. It had passed by once already, but that didn't mean it wouldn't circle back. The thought of it lurking somewhere in the shadows made my stomach churn. I couldn't escape them. I knew that now. But I couldn't just sit here. I couldn't stay trapped in this cabin forever, waiting for them to make their move. I needed to act. I needed to find out who was behind this, or I would never be free. I didn't have a plan. I had no idea what I was doing. But the idea of leaving the town felt like a risk I couldn't take. If I left now, if I ran again, would they just keep following me? Would I ever be able to outrun them? I wasn't sure anymore. By morning, the fear had settled into a sick, constant hum in my chest. I couldn't stop shaking. I tried to make a cup of coffee to calm my nerves, but my hands were too unsteady to pour the water without spilling it. Every time I thought I heard something outside, I froze. Every shadow in the corner of my eye felt like a threat. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, but where could I go? There was nowhere left. Nowhere that felt safe. And even if I could find somewhere to hide, what then? How long would it be before they found me again? That's when I remembered something, the one lead I had. The picture they had sent me months ago. The blurry image of the shadow standing just outside the tent. I knew it wasn't just a random figure. There was something about that image that felt deliberate, like they were toying with me. They wanted me to see it. They wanted me to know that they were watching. The thought made me sick to my stomach. But maybe, just maybe, there was something in that image I had missed. Something I could use to find them before they found me. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo again, zooming in on the figure. It was hard to make out, but there was something familiar about the silhouette. A shape, a posture, that I couldn't place. The more I looked at it, the more I felt like I knew this person. I just couldn't put my finger on it. Then, as I stared at the photo, it hit me. The jacket. The way the person was standing. It was the same jacket I had worn when I hiked into Glacier. That was when it clicked. This wasn't just some random stalker. This was someone who knew me. Someone from my past. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever was behind this had been watching me for a long time. They knew where I had been, what I had done. They knew about Glacier. They knew everything. And they were using that knowledge to torment me, to keep me on the run.
I wanted to cry, but I didn't. There was no time for that. I couldn't waste any more time on fear or doubt. I had to confront this head on. I got up, grabbed my things, and left the cabin. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for them to make their next move. I had to find out who was behind this, and I had to do it now. I started with the local police. It felt like a long shot, but it was the only option I had. The town was small, and I figured if anyone knew anything about strange occurrences, it would be them. The police station was in a small, unassuming building on the edge of town. I walked in, trying to calm my nerves, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt like I was being watched. The officer at the front desk gave me a glance, but he didn't seem particularly interested in my presence. "I need to speak to someone about a serious matter," I said, trying to sound confident. The officer raised an eyebrow but nodded and directed me toward a small office in the back. I followed him down a narrow hallway and into the room. Inside, an older man sat at a desk, flipping through papers. He looked up as I entered, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Small-town life had its toll on people, I could tell. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice dry. I need help," I stammered. "I've been followed. Stalked. I've been getting threats, messages, phone calls. They know everything about me. They know where I've been. I don't know who they are, but they've been tormenting me for months." The officer didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stood up and motioned for me to sit. "Start from the beginning," he said. I told him everything. I explained about the messages, the phone calls, the shadowy figure in the photo. I told him about Glacier and how it had all started there. As I spoke, I could see his eyes narrow. He didn't look surprised, but he didn't look dismissive either. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I've heard stories like this before," he said quietly. "But none of them have ever ended well." I froze. "What do you mean?" He looked at me, his face hardening. "There's a group in these parts. They've been around for years. They like to watch people. Follow them. Get into their heads. They have a way of making people disappear. And when they do, no one ever finds out what happened." A chill ran down my spine. "You mean they're not just stalking me? They're dangerous," he said, cutting me off. "If they're after you, you need to get out of here. And fast." I didn't know what to think. The words echoed in my mind. Dangerous. People disappearing. I had been right all along. Whoever was after me wasn't just playing a game. They weren't just messing with my head. They were trying to do something much worse. I stood up, shaking. How do I get away from them? How do I stop them? The officer's face softened, and he reached into a drawer in his desk. He pulled out a small stack of papers and slid them across to me. "I don't know if this will help, but this is everything we know about them. Names, places, whatever we've been able to gather. It's not much, but it's something." I grabbed the papers and stuffed them into my jacket. My heart was racing. "Thank you," I whispered. As I left the police station, I felt the weight of the officer's words settling in. The threat wasn't just real, it was terrifying. There was no escaping them. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, they would always be there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. And now, I had to find a way to stop them before it was too late. As I stepped out of the police station, the afternoon sun felt like a faint shield against the suffocating dread that had settled over me. The papers the officer had given me were heavy in my jacket pocket, a constant reminder that I was no longer just running from a few strange phone calls and messages. I was facing something much darker, something I had never expected in my wildest nightmares. A group, organized, methodical, and deadly, had been tracking me, following me, and now I was in their sights. And from what the officer had said, I had no idea just how far their reach went. My mind raced as I walked down the quiet street. I could feel the weight of the small town around me, the houses, the shops, the people all going about their business, unaware of the shadow that loomed over me. I needed to find out more about this group. I needed to know who they were, what they wanted, and how to stop them. But most of all, I needed to make sure they didn't find me first. I found a small, dingy cafe and took a seat by the window, away from prying eyes. My hands were still trembling as I pulled the papers out of my jacket and spread them across the table. There were names that meant nothing to me, along with locations, strange symbols, and a series of dates. Nothing made sense at first glance. It was a mess of disconnected information, but I knew it was the only clue I had. I had to piece it together. I started with the names. Most were just first names, written hastily, almost like someone had tried to hide them. There was one name that stood out, Carter Fields. The name felt oddly familiar, like it was tied to something I had heard before, but I couldn't place it. The more I thought about it, the more the name gnawed at me. Who was Carter Fields? And why did I feel like I should know him? I skimmed through the rest of the papers, looking for anything that could connect the dots. The symbols seemed like they were part of a ritual, or maybe some kind of coded language. There were places mentioned, abandoned buildings, old warehouses, forgotten places deep in the woods. None of them were familiar to me, but the thought of venturing into those places made my skin crawl. I had to be careful. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Not now. I pulled out my phone and searched for any information on Carter Fields. The name was too common to get an immediate result, so I refined my search to include the words missing and Wyoming. That's when something caught my eye. A news article, dated a few years back, detailed the disappearance of a man named Carter Fields. According to the article, Carter had been last seen in a small town just a few hours away from where I was now. The article didn't offer many details, only that Carter had been reported missing after going out on a hiking trip by himself. It didn't take much to connect the dots. Carter had disappeared, likely taken, and now his name was on this list. But why? The thought of Carter's disappearance chilled me. This group wasn't just targeting me, they had been doing this for years, pulling people into their web and making them disappear without a trace. Was Carter still alive? And if he was, what had they done to him? The questions swirled in my mind like a storm, and I couldn't push them away. I knew I had to leave the cafe. The longer I stayed there, the more I felt exposed, like I was sitting in a glass box with nowhere to hide. I paid for my coffee and left, clutching the papers tightly in my hand. It was time to find answers, to confront whatever dark force had been tracking me for so long. I had to be careful. I had to move quickly. As I walked to my car, I felt it again, the sensation that I was being watched. The feeling crawled up my spine, making every step feel heavy, as if the earth itself were pressing down on me. I glanced around, but there was nothing unusual. Just people going about their business, cars passing by, the sound of wind rustling through the trees. Yet the feeling didn't go away. I was being hunted. I could sense it. I reached my car and drove out of town, heading towards the location listed on the papers. The small town where Carter Fields had disappeared wasn't far away. I had to see it for myself. Maybe there would be more clues, something I could use to track down whoever was behind this. The road wound through the mountains, the landscape growing more desolate the further I drove. The forest seemed to press in on me, tall, looming trees that blocked out the sun. I felt exposed, isolated in the middle of nowhere, with no one to help if something went wrong. I arrived in the small town late in the afternoon, its streets eerily quiet. The buildings were old, run down, a reflection of the town's faded glory. There was a general store, a few houses, and a small diner. Nothing special. Nothing that screamed danger, but I knew better than to trust appearances. This was where Carter Fields had disappeared, and I was willing to bet this was also where I'd find more answers. I parked my car in the lot of the diner and walked inside. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the scent of coffee and fried food filled the air. The few patrons sitting at the counter barely looked up, lost in their own worlds. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, gave me a half-smile when I sat down. "Can I help you, hon?" she asked, her voice thick with a southern accent. "I'm just passing through," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for information about a man named Carter Fields. He went missing a few years ago. Do you know anything about it?" The waitress paused for a moment, her smile fading. She looked me over carefully, her eyes narrowing. "Carter? What's that to you?" "I'm doing some research," I said, not wanting to reveal too much. "I heard he went missing from around here. I was hoping someone might know what happened." She looked at me for a long time, then sighed. "Carter wasn't the kind of guy you ask about around here. He was part of something no one talks about. He got too close to the wrong people, and one night, he just vanished. Some say he went off into the mountains, but I don't believe that for a second. It's been years, and no one's ever found him. Some people around here think he might still be out there, but if he is, he's not the man he used to be." I felt a chill run down my spine. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Carter hadn't just disappeared, he had been taken. Taken by the same group that had been stalking me, following me. They had taken him, and now they were after me too. "Do you know where he was last seen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The waitress shook her head. "It's better if you don't know. Trust me, you don't want to get involved with that crowd. Some things are better left alone." But I couldn't leave. Not now. I had to know the truth. I couldn't stop myself, even as the sense of danger pressed in on me from all sides. "I have to find out," I said softly. "I have to know what happened to him." The waitress hesitated, looking over her shoulder before lowering her voice. "If you really want to know, there's an old trail up in the mountains. It's hard to get to, and it's been abandoned for years. They say people who go up there, they don't come back." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The mountains. The abandoned trail. This was where it all started, and where it might end. I thanked her quietly and left the diner, the waitress's words echoing in my head. As I got into my car, I realized that there was no turning back now. Whatever I found in those mountains would change everything. And whether I liked it or not, I was going to have to face the truth about Carter Fields, about the group stalking me, and about the darkness that had been following me for so long. The only question now was whether I would make it out alive. The drive up into the mountains was harrowing. The road narrowed as I ascended, winding tighter and tighter through the dense forest. The higher I climbed, the more isolated I felt. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. The air grew thin and sharp, and a strange sense of heaviness pressed down on me. The mountain was alive with a quiet, eerie energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something, or someone, was out there, watching. I followed the directions the waitress had given me, driving as far as I could until the road came to a dead end at a small, dilapidated parking lot. From here, the trail began, an old, overgrown path leading deeper into the mountain wilderness. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a scent of pine and something else I couldn't quite place. A faint, acrid smell that set my nerves on edge. I grabbed my flashlight, tucked it into my jacket, and locked my car behind me. There was no turning back now. I had to know what had happened to Carter Fields, to the people who had been watching me, to the mysterious group that had been following my every move for months. I couldn't live in fear any longer. I had to face this, no matter the cost. The trail was rough, hardly a path at all in places, but I pushed on, the uneven ground beneath my boots the only sound in the growing darkness. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel that the mountain was swallowing me whole, as if it was drawing me deeper into its heart. Every crackling branch, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent my mind spinning. My thoughts kept drifting back to Carter Fields. What had happened to him? Had he been taken by the same people who were after me? And if so, what had they done to him? I continued on, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the trees. The forest was dense, the shadows thick, and it wasn't long before the trail became less and less discernible. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I became. I had read about abandoned trails and stories, places where people went missing or encountered something they were never meant to see, but this felt different. This felt like I was walking into a trap. Then, I saw it. The remnants of an old stone structure half hidden by the overgrowth. It was barely visible in the dim light, but the moment I saw it, something clicked inside my mind. This was no coincidence. This was where Carter Fields had been last seen. This was where the answers lay. I moved closer, my heart racing in my chest. The stones were cold, ancient, as though they had been standing for centuries. The structure seemed to have once been a small building or a shrine, but now it was little more than a ruin, half collapsed, consumed by the forest around it. There was an unsettling feeling in the air, a tension that I couldn't explain. I stepped inside cautiously, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots sounding unnaturally loud. The flashlight illuminated the space, revealing faded symbols carved into the walls. The designs were strange, twisted lines, intricate patterns that seemed to shift as I looked at them. They looked ancient, like something from a forgotten time. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of them, but before I could, I heard something. A sound. A whisper. It was faint at first, just a rustling in the air, but as I listened, I realized it wasn't the wind. Someone was breathing. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence of the mountain. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow flitted between the trees just outside the structure, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was fast, too fast for me to get a clear look, but it was there. I wasn't alone. Panic gripped me, and I immediately backed toward the entrance, my eyes scanning every corner of the ruin. My mind raced. Who could it be? The people who had been stalking me? Had they found me here, in this desolate place? Was this their territory, their hideout? I didn't wait to find out. I ran. I sprinted out of the stone structure, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I plunged back into the forest. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding as I pushed through the underbrush, trying to keep my footing on the uneven ground. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist as I moved, and I could feel something, someone, closing in behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know who was following me, or if I was just imagining it. The sounds of footsteps in the distance were growing louder, but I refused to stop. I couldn't. I had to get out. I had to make it to the car and get away before they caught up with me. Suddenly, I stumbled, my foot catching on a root. I fell forward, my hands hitting the cold ground hard. My flashlight tumbled from my grip, spinning away into the darkness. For a split second, everything went silent, and I lay there, disoriented, trying to catch my breath. But I could feel it, something was wrong. The air was heavy, charged with a strange energy, and the forest around me seemed to be closing in. I scrambled to my feet, but then I heard it. A voice. A whisper in the wind, so low I almost missed it. "You're not leaving." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. It was guttural, primal, like the sound of something ancient and monstrous. It sent a wave of terror through me, freezing me in place. I felt the presence before I saw it. A figure stepped up from the shadows, its outline barely visible in the darkness. I could make out its shape, tall, gaunt, its body shrouded in a dark cloak. But it was the eyes that terrified me. They glowed with an unnatural light, bright and piercing, like they could see straight into my soul. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. I had no idea what this was, but I knew one thing: it wasn't human. The figure stepped forward, its movements fluid, almost gliding across the ground. Its presence was suffocating, like the air itself had thickened around me. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I was paralyzed, frozen by fear. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. Its glowing eyes seemed to pierce through me, steadying me, and for a moment, I thought it was going to attack. But instead, it spoke. "You've come too far." Its voice was like the rustling of dry leaves, harsh and unsettling. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape more than anything, but my legs wouldn't move. The presence of this thing, whatever it was, held me in place. And then it stepped closer. "You should have stayed away." I felt the weight of its words, as though the mountain itself was speaking to me. As if I had trespassed into a place I was never meant to be. The figure reached out, and I felt a cold, suffocating pressure against my chest. Something was pulling me toward it, but I couldn't fight it. The world around me spun, and I felt myself being dragged deeper into the mountain, deeper into the shadows. I tried to scream again, but it was useless. The darkness closed in, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the glowing eyes of the figure, staring into mine with an almost predatory hunger. The world around me seemed to bend and warp, and the air grew colder, more suffocating. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, heavy, trapped in an invisible grip. My mind was racing, panic surging through me like a tidal wave. The last thing I saw, the glowing eyes of the figure, haunted me, burning into my memory as the darkness closed in. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, only moments had passed. Then, just as suddenly as the sensation had overwhelmed me, it stopped. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat felt like a drum in my ears. The cold, unnatural grip loosened, but the terror remained. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam shaking wildly as I tried to scan the area. The figure was gone. I looked around, but there was nothing. Just the cold, silent forest, quiet and still, as if nothing had ever happened. I couldn't understand it. One moment, I had been face to face with something I couldn't comprehend, and the next, it had vanished into thin air. I felt the overwhelming urge to run, to get away, as fast as I could. But fear held me in place, a gnawing, clawing feeling deep in my gut that made it impossible to move. My flashlight shone on the ground, and I noticed something that sent a chill through me, a small pile of dirt, disturbed and fresh. The ground was soft here, recently dug, and something beneath the earth seemed to pulse, like it was alive. I stood slowly, heart pounding. The presence I had felt earlier wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the shadows. I could sense it, waiting. I had to get out. I turned, almost blindly, and began to stumble back the way I came. The trail was barely visible now, swallowed by the darkness and the thick undergrowth. My breath was shallow, each step feeling like a burden. I kept hearing things, rustling in the trees, something following me, something too fast to catch, just out of my peripheral vision. And then I heard it. A voice, faint at first, almost drowned out by the wind. But as I slowed, trying to make sense of it, the voice became clearer, more distinct. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating like a warning. They were deep, gravelly, almost otherworldly. My heart lurched, but I kept moving, even though my instincts screamed at me to stop. There was no more time to waste. I had to find the answers. I stumbled upon a clearing, and in the middle, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a massive stone altar. The air around it was thick, charged with an unnatural energy. Symbols, similar to the ones I had seen carved into the ruins, were etched into the stone, pulsing with a faint, eerie light. I couldn't help but approach. Something inside me pushed me forward, an unspoken compulsion that I couldn't resist. As I got closer, I noticed something else, a figure, crouched on the altar, its form barely visible in the dim light. The closer I got, the more I could make out the features of the person, or at least, what had once been a person. It was Carter Fields. His body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over bones, eyes wide open, staring blankly into the sky. His mouth was cracked, but he made no sound. His entire body was covered in those same strange symbols I had seen before, carved into his skin, glowing faintly, like he had been marked by whatever dark force resided in this place. A low growl echoed from somewhere in the darkness, and I froze, my blood turning to ice. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. A shadow, something large and monstrous, shifted just beyond the reach of my flashlight. The air seemed to crackle with the sound of something ancient, something hungry. The ground beneath me rumbled, and I stumbled back in panic. The altar began to shake, and the symbols carved into it flickered, as if they were alive, pulsing with an energy I could feel in the pit of my stomach. The growl grew louder, and I turned, my eyes wild with fear, as a massive figure emerged from the trees. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, tall, impossibly tall, its body twisted and contorted in grotesque ways. Its eyes were hollow, filled with an abyssal darkness, and its mouth opened wide in a jagged grin, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to stretch on forever. The creature's skin was blackened and cracked, as if it had been burned by something far older than fire itself. I backed away, but the creature was faster than I could react. It lunged, its long limbs reaching for me with terrifying speed. My instincts kicked in, and I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly through the woods, knowing that if I stopped for even a moment, it would catch me. The sound of the creature's footsteps echoed behind me, and I could hear its breath, slow and labored, like it was savoring every moment of the chase. I didn't know how long I ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare stop. I finally stumbled back to the stone ruins, where the path forked in several directions. The creature was still behind me, closer now, and I had to make a choice. I had no idea which way to go, but I picked the trail to my right and sprinted down it, praying that it would lead me out of the woods. The forest was alive with sound, branches cracking underfoot, animals scurrying through the underbrush, and above all, the sound of the creature, still following, relentless. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, faster, my eyes searching desperately for any sign of civilization. Anything that could save me. I stumbled into a small clearing, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the glow of headlights in the distance, my car, the road, the way out. But as I moved forward, I realized it was just a trick of the light, a mirage. The trees loomed large around me, trapping me in the wilderness. Then, I heard the voice again. "You're not leaving." The words were all around me now, echoing in the air, coming from every direction. I turned in a circle, disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. The creature was close. Too close. I had no choice but to keep running, to fight against whatever dark force had taken control of this place. But as the shadow loomed over me, something inside me broke. I couldn't outrun it anymore. The mountain had claimed me. And no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I fought, it would always be one step ahead. A final scream tore from my throat, but it was drowned out by the growl of the creature as it closed in. I stumbled through the underbrush, my legs aching, my breath ragged and uneven. The creature's growls were closer now, echoing through the trees like a symphony of terror. My eyes darted around in a panic, searching for any escape. The path ahead seemed to narrow, the trees closing in like they were part of a trap, guiding me further into the depths of the forest. There was no way out. I could feel the ground shift beneath my feet, the earth trembling with each step the creature took. It was moving faster now, its footsteps pounding like thunder in the distance. I tried to push through the branches, but they tangled around my arms and legs, pulling me back, slowing me down. My hands scraped against the rough bark as I fought to break free, but the forest seemed to hold me in its grip, dragging me deeper into its heart. The cold was overwhelming. The air was thick, heavy, filled with an unnatural chill that gnawed at my skin. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore, couldn't feel my legs. All I could hear was the growling behind me, louder and louder, until it was deafening. And then, for the first time in what felt like hours, the growling stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine as I slowly turned around. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure. It was no longer a blurry silhouette. It was solid, real, and it was staring at me, its eyes burning with that same malevolent glow. The creature was tall, unnaturally tall, and its body was still twisted and contorted, as if its bones were not meant to bend in such unnatural ways. Its skin was blackened, scorched by something ancient and powerful, and its mouth opened in a grin that seemed to stretch far too wide. Its teeth were jagged, sharp, like shards of glass, gleaming in the dim light of my flashlight. It took a step forward, its limbs moving with unnatural fluidity. Its eyes never left me, piercing into my soul, reading every fear, every thought. It knew me. It knew everything about me. And it wanted me. "You should have stayed away," the voice rasped, a deep, guttural whisper that sent chills through my entire body. The air around me grew colder with each word, the words themselves wrapping around me like chains, tightening with each breath I took. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to escape, but there was no escape from this. The creature took another step forward, and I could see the glint of its eyes as it reached out, its hand stretching toward me. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. "Carter Fields," the creature whispered, its voice full of contempt. "He was weak. Just like you." The words hit me like a slap, and I could feel my heart pounding harder in my chest. Carter had been here, just like I had. But what had happened to him? What had they done to him? What was I about to become? The creature's lips curled into a grin, its teeth gleaming in the fading light. It leaned in closer, and I could smell something foul, rotting, decaying, like something long dead. It was too close now. Its hand was almost upon me. And then, in that final moment, I saw it. Behind the creature, in the distance, I saw something familiar. A faint glow, like headlights shining through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It was my car. I didn't know how or why, but I didn't care. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. I wasn't trapped. There was a way out. I had to move. I had to get to the car. In a surge of adrenaline, I broke free from the paralysis. I turned and ran. The creature screeched behind me, an inhuman sound that made my skin crawl, but I didn't look back. I could hear it moving, faster now, chasing me, but I refused to stop. I pushed through the underbrush, my feet stumbling, but my eyes locked on the distant glow of the headlights. I could make it. I had to make it. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sounds of the creature grew louder, closer. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the clearing, my chest burning, my legs like jelly, and there it was, the car. My heart leaped into my throat, and I didn't waste a second. I threw open the door, climbed inside, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the keys, my mind foggy with panic, but I found them. I turned the ignition and slammed my foot down on the gas. The tires screamed as I sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the dark, the forest blurring past in a rush. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but I didn't dare slow down. I had no idea how close the creature was, or if it was still following me, but I couldn't afford to think about it. I drove, and I drove, until the forest finally gave way to the open road. The headlights of my car illuminated the asphalt ahead, and I allowed myself to breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. My hands were still shaking, my body trembling from the adrenaline, but I had escaped. For now. As I drove away, I could feel the weight of the mountain behind me, looming, watching, waiting. The creature, the force that had been following me, was it really gone? Or had it merely retreated, biding its time, waiting for the next opportunity to strike? I didn't know. And maybe, in some part of me, I didn't want to know. But what I did know was this: whatever had been hunting me was not finished. It had merely let me go for now. And I had no doubt that one day, it would come for me again. Because the mountains are alive. And they do not let go of their prey so easily. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.